Chapter 5. A Vicious Caller. "Oh, please tell me more about the coughs," Nancy begged Mrs. Parsons. "Well, I don't know too much, my dear," she replied. "Mr. Cough is a writer. He's a very eccentric, excitable person. He and his daughter Millie have been staying at the Claymore Hotel. Millie is a talented dancer, so we asked her to be in the charity show. I believe she studied abroad." A physical description of Mr. Cough fitted the man who had sat across from Nancy during the plane trip. She asked Mrs. Parsons if she might use her telephone, and when the woman nodded, Nancy called the Claymore Hotel. During other cases on which she had worked, Nancy had become acquainted with the manager. After identifying herself, she asked for the forwarding address of the Coughs. "I'm sorry, Nancy," the manager replied, "but they did not leave one. Are they involved in some mystery?" "Possibly," Nancy said. "If any word comes from them, will you please notify me?" The manager assured her that he would. When she told Mrs. Parsons of the conversation, the woman shook her head in disappointment and said she would have to find a substitute for Millie. "How about you taking the part?" she asked. Nancy laughed. "You flatter me, Mrs. Parsons. I'd be glad to help you out with some of the dancing, but please don't put me in as a soloist. I haven't had time for any ballet dancing in recent years." "But you still dance exceedingly well," said the chairman of the charity show. "And I'm sure you could learn the speaking part easily." There was no talking Mrs. Parsons out of her idea. She was flustered and concerned. Not only had she lost Millie Cough as soloist, but also Hélène Fontaine as coach. The woman began walking the floor distractedly. "All right, Mrs. Parsons," Nancy said. "I'll do the best I can for you, but if Millie Cough comes back, I'll bow out." From a desk, Mrs. Parsons produced a script of the whole performance. Flipping over several pages, she came to the scene in which Millie Cough was to have appeared. She and Nancy sat down and went over the part together. When they finished, Nancy had to admit that there was not much to the role, and she could quickly learn the speaking part. She herself would have to develop the dance act. With a copy of the script under her arm, Nancy hurried off, promising to report for rehearsal that afternoon. Already behind schedule, she found Ned Nickerson's mother waiting for her outside the door of the Fontaines dancing school. Nancy walked up to her, smiling, and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Nickerson. I'm sorry I'm late." Mrs. Nickerson looked very pretty, she thought, with her prematurely white wavy hair, her petite figure, and her stylishly tailored cotton dress. As Nancy unlocked the door, she said, "Mrs. Nickerson, the Fontaines wanted me to tell you how much they appreciate what you're doing. And you know that I do. First I dragged Ned into helping me solve mysteries, and now you." Mrs. Nickerson said she was glad to be included, and hoped that something exciting would happen. She and Nancy spent an hour together, checking the schedule of classes and going through the registration cards to become acquainted with the pupils. When everything was ready, Nancy found that she would be free for half an hour before her first class. She decided to start work on the dance she would perform in the benefit show. Nancy found a leotard in her size and put it on in the dressing room. Then she walked into the large practice room, which had mirrors on 3 walls. "First I'll listen to the record that Millie Cough was going to use," Nancy decided. She placed the Satiric Polka by Shostakovich on the turntable and flicked on the switch. As the music filled the room, Nancy shut her eyes and let her feet and body move naturally to the distinctive rhythm. "Of course, I haven't the same ballet technique as Millie," she thought, "but I'll improvise to the music, combining ballet and rhythmic modern dancing. That should do the trick." She played the record over several times until her choreography had formed a regular pattern. Naturally graceful and limber, and with a love for mystery, Nancy suddenly found herself giggling. Her dance had become a little mystery in itself, portraying the conflict between someone being pursued and the pursuer. "I'll need a lot of practice," Nancy said to herself, as she performed the final leap with an intricate turn. Nancy heard several pupils arriving for their class and hurried into the dressing room to change to street clothes. The substitute teacher arrived, and everything went well. Nancy and Mrs. Nickerson had luncheon together. Then Nancy, again borrowing the leotard, left for the charity show rehearsal at the Civic Center. She went at once to the auditorium, where several of the performers were on stage, talking to Mrs. Parsons. Among them was a man who now turned and came down the steps. As he hurried toward a side door, Nancy looked at him in amazement. He was the man who had stopped her on the country road. As quickly as she could, Nancy ran across the back of the auditorium and down the last aisle toward the exit which he had taken. When she reached the corridor, he was not in sight. A porter mopping the floor told her that a man had gone out a nearby door. She dashed outside and up an alley to the street. By the time Nancy reached it, the man had disappeared. For several minutes she watched the passing cars, hoping that the man might have parked and now would drive by. But her hopes were in vain, and in disappointment she returned to the auditorium and donned the leotard. Mrs. Parsons introduced her to the other players and explained that Nancy was taking the part which Millie Koff had planned to play. "I think we'll go over that first," Mrs. Parsons said. She explained that Nancy had been given the part only that morning, but she was sure she would do well. Nancy hoped so too, and was not displeased with her performance, although she realized it could be improved upon. When her part in the rehearsal was over, she walked up to Mrs. Parsons and asked about the man who had been in the auditorium a short time before. "I don't know his name," Mrs. Parsons replied. "He came in here to ask about Hélène Fontaine." Mrs. Parsons explained that he was very eager to find the young dancing school teacher and wanted her address. "Of course I couldn't give it to him," said Mrs. Parsons. "He acted as if he did not believe me and went off in a huff." Nancy asked some of the performers who were standing around if they knew who he was, but no one did. He must be a stranger in town, Nancy decided, as she put her street clothes over her leotard and left the auditorium. "I wonder if he is really a friend of the Fontaines." Nancy returned to the dancing school and learned from Mrs. Nickerson that everything had been going well. "Nothing has happened in connection with the mystery," she reported. "Nancy, I'm dreadfully sorry, but I'll have to leave right away. I almost forgot an engagement I had made previously. It's too late now to break it. Would you be able to take over for the rest of the afternoon?" "Oh, certainly," said Nancy. "I'll be in first thing tomorrow morning," Mrs. Nickerson promised. Nancy thanked her and sat down at the receptionist's desk. A few minutes after Mrs. Nickerson had gone, Bess arrived to take over a class of little girls. "Hello, Nancy," she said. "Any news?" Nancy told her about the man at the auditorium. Bess shivered and again warned Nancy to be careful. "Well, there's one place I'm sure I'll be safe," said Nancy with a chuckle. "That's right here in the dancing school. I'm going to stay the rest of the afternoon and evening." Bess heaved a sigh. "You know, I'm scared silly to take this class. I've never taught dancing in my life." Nancy tried to reassure her friend as Bess went into the dressing room. About 20 minutes later, she peeked into the big room. Everything was going well, the little ballerinas paying strict attention. It was amusing to watch them try to imitate Bess. As Nancy returned to the desk, a woman hurried into the reception room. She was a coarse-looking person, wearing too much makeup and a strong, pungent perfume. She was dressed in a flowered red and green dress, and a red hat was perched on her helter-skelter reddish curls. "Where is Ellen Fontaine?" the woman asked abruptly. "Miss Fontaine is not here right now," Nancy replied. "I'm Mrs. Judson," the woman said tartly. "Ellen is a good friend of mine. I've heard she left town. The idea of her going without telling me! What's her address?" "I'm afraid I can't give it to you," said Nancy. Mrs. Judson cried in a loud voice. "That's ridiculous! Helen wouldn't run off without telling somebody here at the school where she was going." She stamped her foot angrily. "I demand to know where Ellen and Henri Fontaine are." "I cannot tell you, Mrs. Judson," Nancy said firmly, her eyes flashing. The woman went into a tirade, shouting that Nancy had no right to keep the information from her. Finally, Nancy could take the abuse no longer. She arose from the desk and came around to escort Mrs. Judson outside. "There are children here," she said, "and we can't have a disturbance." Mrs. Judson glowered as Nancy took her arm and led her out to the stairway. Suddenly, Mrs. Judson shook herself free of Nancy's grasp, turned halfway around, and jammed her elbow hard into the girl's hip. Nancy lost her balance. She reached frantically for the banister, missed, and pitched headlong down the steps. End of chapter 5.